Well, hello everyone, Stakui here, and I'm actually not joined by Gabby. I am here joined by Valeria. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Valeria Cuervo from Traveling Cuervo, and I make videos about the history of places I travel and like research and anything I do that has to do with history.
It's awesome to hear. So for anyone that is confused, anyone who might be listening in for the first time, to explain what this is, again, my name is Steven, aka Stakui, the host of the History of Everything podcast. I also have my main Stakui page when it came to TikTok, and the Stakui page on YouTube pretty much became a gaming channel dedicated to history games, but there is still the History of Everything podcast page, which you haven't checked that out already, please do so. What I wanted to do is I wanted to start bringing more people on to talk to them about their particular topics, what it is that they, would like to discuss on anything. And then as you can see right now, this is visual. Well, I mean, if you're listening to the podcast right now, then it's not visual. Very obviously, it's audio. There's going to be a copy of this thing that is going to be up on YouTube on the History of Everything podcast page. So if you actually want to see what I look like or what Valeria looks like, or any of the things that I may bring or pop up in front of the screen after some editing to add some images for whatever it is that we're talking about, then, you're going to be able to see it there. But anyway, okay, so we had a topic that we were going to kind of talk about, but honestly, it can go anywhere in any direction. As I said, this is the history of everything. It's one of the more confusing things that people asked about before. It's like, well, what are you going to cover? Or what are you going to do? It's anything. It could literally go anywhere. You could literally do anything. Do you want to talk about potatoes? Do you want to talk about the Crusades? Do you want to talk about like Vikings? Do you want to talk about the dress habits? Literally could be anything. But in your case, you were working on a project about Vikings, right? I think that is what Gabby explained to me because she loves your stuff. My wife loves your stuff because she loves travel. She loves all this stuff, but she likes learning with it. And she said that, quote, you had a perfect voice for explaining the stuff.
That's so sweet. Yeah, you can tell your wife I love her, everything she does too. So essentially, I got a research grant from my university, NYU. And so the last couple of months I was in Scandinavia filming and making a mini documentary series about Vikings, but it's more about the Viking legacy. So it's kind of looking at why white supremacists are obsessed with Vikings and what people are doing in response to protect the sort of Viking legacy.
Interesting. Okay, because that is very specific because I've talked about this before with multiple topics from pirates to samurai to Vikings. Vikings is one of the most heavily featured ones in there in regards to romanticization. I've talked about all kinds of different groups and how it is that they are romanticized very heavily. And there is so much when it comes to Vikings. I think in recent, the past 4 years, I think there has been along the lines of 5 different television and or movies that are all Vikings. And I still remember, and people might give me hate for this here, but the Vikings TV show, literally that is just called Vikings. The first series wasn't necessarily so bad. It was exaggerated. It had all of the flair that you would expect that would be in that kind of show. But the second season just takes all of that flair and then makes it even more insultingly less historically accurate. I think that the worst part about any of that, forget what you want to say about the characters, forget what you want to say about depictions of people to where it's just jarringly out of place, forget any of that. The most annoying part about the entire show is every 5 seconds someone going, yes, we Vikings, us Vikings are in here for the fight. We Vikings never back down. And it's like, for the love of God, shut up. You don't refer to yourself as Viking. That's not a thing. Dear God.
It's really insane. I will admit, I've watched the show. I've watched Vikings from the History Channel, Vikings Valhalla.
That's the one in Valhalla is the one that I'm thinking of as the second series.
That one's insane. They do refer to themselves as Vikings all the time. And I'm like, there's no Viking nation. Where the hell are they getting this? So I don't know. I think it's enjoyable as long as people don't realize that it's fully a fantasy.
Oh, incredibly. It's one of those things that has been a trend throughout all of human history to romanticize or elevate things. But within modern media, it's just, I say this as a person that I started off on TikTok, and in comparison to going to places like what you do, which I love, and that's what I'm only just now starting to do. I was able to do live shots while I myself was in Norway and in Sweden of the different sites. But it's like in the age of modern media, it's so easy to just create and do these things. And so it's great that people are able to tell stories, but also simultaneously, it opens up the possibility of so much. I'm not even going to use the term degradation. What would be the proper term for this? It's not even necessarily misuse or abuse. It's
dramatization.
That's probably the best way that I could phrase it. Yeah, that's right. You're right. There's so much dramatization when it comes to things. And you're talking about eras and scenes that were filled with drama already, and they're just made even more so.
I love about history is like how, like, people don't realize how dramatic it is. Like, people obviously romanticize everything, but like the fact that like the Red Wedding was like an actual thing, sometimes like, minds boggle my brain. Like, I'm like, how?
Yeah. That's the thing that people, it was just what happened. And it's like you hear about some of the circumstances of things happening in, say, battles or whatnot, that it sounds like someone like, oh, yeah, it's a deus ex machina. There's no way that would happen. And then there's real life examples of things happening. Like, for example, the eclipse that stopped an entire war. Because just like a dramatic scene in a movie where it's like, and all the parties stopped, gazed upon into the sky, and they laid down their arms and stopped fighting. Like some happy-go ending story to some big book. And it's like, no, that legit actually happened. Like in ancient Greece, going into Anatolia, there was this major battle between these two powers. And during the middle of it, there was an eclipse, and they took it as a sign that the gods were angry because it happened directly over them. The likelihood of that happening, because, eclipses aren't visible everywhere. The likelihood of that happening is like less than 1% of an eclipse actually occur. I say less than, it's like way less. And for that to even occur during a battle at that exact moment, the likelihood is so low that it just was actually seen as a sign from the gods.
Oh my, that's insane.
Remember when I said history of everything? That the other thing that we're famous for on this podcast is going off on tangents, because we started about Vikings and now it's gone on to the eclipse. This is going to happen repeatedly. I'm just letting you know that right now.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, who doesn't go on tangents?
So Vikings and your studies and supremacists. Where did that start?
So actually, I do mostly econ, but like I took this random history, like I audit a lot of my classes, but I took this random course about Vikings. It was like 2 credits. And like the first thing the professor said, he was like, oh, how everyone knows how white supremacists start starts with Vikings. And I literally went like, what? Like, I was like, I had no idea. So as you do, I went on a tangent in class and I started looking up and I was like, holy crap, this is a huge problem, because like white supremacists essentially are taking like Viking symbols. When I say Viking symbols, it's like a huge, like, I mean like Norse symbols, but like people just know the term Viking. And like they're using the symbols and like they're literally creating like violence. Like the perpetrator of the New Zealand church massacre wrote like, see you in Valhalla. And there was this other guy that was like being like, hail Vinland and stuff like that. So like it's a real problem where white supremacists are obsessed with Vikings because of how they're portrayed in the media. And also like there's like a weird history, like it's a really weird history. And then more importantly, that affects to people that have like actual connections to like Scandinavian heritage, people who want to learn about Vikings but don't want to be involved with like white supremacists. So I was like, oh, what would be really interesting to figure out why this became a problem and what people are doing in response. So that's kind of started my research.
That is actually really interesting, because I do know some of what you are talking about. Like, as an example, for anyone that might not be aware, the Finnish unit of the SS back during World War II, this was the Viking unit. It was the Viking unit. Like, that's what it was. Like, because and I've gotten into trouble on TikTok where I once did a badass in history on Laurie Allen Turney, who are you familiar with who that is? So Laurie Allen Turney was a Finnish soldier who fought in the Finnish army when the Soviet Union invaded Finland. After Finland was defeated, he joined up with the Germans in order to learn sabotage techniques and essentially guerrilla tactics before going back to Finland and then continuing the fight on with the Soviets. So there were many volunteers from these countries that had been taken over by the Soviets in their wars that actually joined up with Nazi Germany despite not being Nazis. And they did that specifically because, well, this is the group that is fighting our enemy that we hate because they keep on attacking our homeland. So they did that. And when I covered his story and how he was a soldier in the Finnish army, he joined up with the Germans. And then he actually, while he was living under an assumed name, he jumped off a boat from a Swedish ship that was going by Florida, I believe it was, swam to the U.S. shore, filed for asylum, and then joined the army and became a Green Beret, where he then went on to fight in Vietnam as a Green Beret before his helicopter was finally shot down and he died. So he was known as the soldier of three armies. And that's something that when I've talked about these people and what it is that they did, even in that mythos there, the Viking unit, because that's what was associated. The SS, you couldn't, if you were a volunteer, you couldn't join the army. You had to be in the SS. But people think that if you're in the SS, that means that's the Holocaust. Those are the people that are doing that. And the answer is no. The SS is specifically a separate division of the military. It's an entirely separate division under a separate control that the only way to join up with the Germans as a volunteer, if you were outside of Germany, was to be part of the SS. So there were different divisions, different components. It's like saying like, oh, I'm in the government. Oh, you're in the CIA? No, I'm in the I'm in the State Department. What are you talking about?
Actually, it was funny because like the Nazis, when they were trying to get volunteers, especially from like the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they made these posters about like Vikings. And it was like saluting them. And they were like, come fight with us, join the army, blah, 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 blah. And so like it was through those posters that we get the modern image of the Viking, of like the blonde, blue-eyed warrior, because that didn't exist before. Like people didn't really like have like an actual idea of what a Viking like looked like physically. Like people were just like, oh, like Vikings were like a thing in the past.
Mm-hmm. I know, well, there were some images, but it was specifically of German origin that made it though, because there were like maybe some of the more modern romanticized image of it does come, but there were also the older images that go back into, say, the 1800s when they became obsessed with the creation of like the Icelandic sagas and creating the stories for like opera. And for like, that was a huge, huge thing in Vienna.
Remember, what was the guy's name? Richard Wagner?
Yes.
I kept trying to Richard Wagner and his little, I can never say the name of the opera. And I have studied it so many times that I cannot remember. Something about rings. That's all.
Why am I forgetting? I feel like I should know this, but but I do know exactly what you're talking about. And yes, that is something that has always been the interesting thing. And people I don't think they talk about it as much because they think it more so associated with just like the idealized image of the warrior. But when looking back at history, it's not just the warrior, it's specifically a tie to culture. There was a thing with the Nazis and with other groups that specifically wanted to remove what they saw as outside influence and return to a state of purity. So now it's getting really dicey when talking about that with this particular subject. But that goes with all societies throughout history, especially during periods of colonization. Like there was this whole point with Zaire that after becoming an independent state, and wanting to remove all colonial names, like the president, which I can't remember his name, but he of course had a Christian name, and then encouraged and even forced people to change back to their roots, like their heritage names. There was a whole movement within Nazi Germany to get rid of Christianity and to go back to the ancient like German paganism. The Lithuanians also had that. Like there was a whole movement in Lithuania and Estonia as well to go back to like the Perungian roots, like the old Baltic faith.
But you are the first person I have talked about this who is not a professor who knows about this.
Welcome to my life. It's just random things everywhere.
But yeah, it's insane.
Mm-hmm. So people would associate this when it comes to religion. And so we've talked about that for more of Europe, but it goes everywhere all over the world. Like obviously one of the things that is in the media's mind right now is more so the thing associated with, say, white supremacists, but that is literally everywhere. You see it from like the like Black and Islamic nationalists. You would see it from, I still distinctly remember because it's one of my favorite time periods to study, the Boxer Rebellion in China. Are you familiar with it? Like the idea of going back to the old roots, the idea of making yourself pure so that modern weaponry can't touch you. So do you know about like what it is they believed and did?
I don't the specifics, but actually we're covering that. I'm auditing this class about Imperial China. So
then fantastic. You're going to see it then. You're going to see it. I'm going to give you this tidbit for anyone. This is just a fun fact for anyone that may not be aware, but it's one of my favorite just dumb things because I like irony. I know it's dark. To really find the humor in this, but it's so deliciously stupid, and I have to laugh because of how dumb it is. One of the great tenets within the Boxer Rebellion, and they were called the Boxers because they didn't really use modern weaponry. They used swords and fists and clubs, and like that was the idea because it was the rise of the old pure system and the removal of outside Western influence. And they would do a test where after months of this, like, think of the most stereotypical kung fu movie you can imagine with all like the training and the poses and the muscle techniques and everything, like the worst, cheesiest flick that you could imagine. And that's what they were doing as training. They were going through all these manuals. And then after months of this training, the initiate would be brought forward into an arena. And then the overseer of it would test their spiritual power and determine if they were pure enough by shooting them with a gun. And if they survived, that meant that they were immune to bullets. Now, mind you, they were not shot with a real gun. It was a real gun, but it was blank bullets. So everyone passed. Like, that's just what they would do. If they had a troublemaker they wanted to get rid of, they would use a real bullet and kill them. Because that way they could actually control things within their ranks. If you wanted to assassinate someone, it was a very effective tool because no one would be able to prove it otherwise. It's like, oh yeah, no, that guy was immune to bullets, but that guy wasn't. He clearly must have been bad. Clearly. And so they would give these peasants the belief that they were immune to bullets and then just send them running into machine guns.
Only history is this dramatic. Like, not even like TV shows can come up with that.
See, that's the exact thing that I'm saying.
I don't understand why they have to make Vikings even more dramatic. Like, I'm like, so much of this like doesn't need to happen. Like, there wasn't 10,000 people just rushing into battle, but whatever.
No, they don't even have to do stuff for the individual stories, honestly. And this is why I appreciate stuff like for anyone who has seen the Last Kingdom. The Last Kingdom, among everything that is recently created, is perhaps the best done, in my opinion. Especially the battle scenes. Initially, a number of them, as they evolved later on, it became the typical Hollywood bullshit, people charging at each other with swords drawn and raised in these massive pitched battles. But have you seen The Last Kingdom? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Do you know what you're talking about? But that was the one that I personally...
Oh, dang. Okay, so it's not a spoiler for me to tell you this, but you know how Vikings primarily fought, like the Norse, they primarily fought in, say, a shield wall formation, right? And the reason why they did this, for anyone that isn't aware, think of it similar to the Greek phalanx, where you would be locking shields with each person next to you and forming a compact block as you would go up against another force that is also in a compact block. They did this not just because it was a fairly strong formation by itself, but because you would have the most experienced soldiers, like the actual warriors, on the outside, on the flanks, and then on the inside, the direct center would be your weakest farmers, like the majority. It's like you have the top 10% on either side, and then you have the 90% chaff that's just stuffed into the middle, and they're in there because if they're locked in the middle, they can't run away and move. They're stuck by the warriors on the flank who are pinning them and holding them together as a kind of block to push back the enemy. So that's why they did that formation. It is rarely ever seen except for small defensive initial opening stages of battle when it comes to movies and TV shows. But The Last Kingdom, when it opens up, there's a battle where it's actually shield to shield and you can see the pushing and they're doing this. And it's a very static formation. They're not able to really do anything. And then all of a sudden, one of the opposing enemy units, they had some men stationed in an ambush that rise up behind the hill and come out after them. And the block can't respond. Like they're trying, and the whole thing just devolves into chaos because the moment that the shield wall breaks, everything just falls apart and they're slaughtered. Because that's actually how that would happen. It doesn't turn into some dramatic 1v1 melee where it's like people individually pairing off against another person and like block, slash. Like I'm being dramatic right now on here, but you know what I'm talking about, of like the typical choreographed fighting.
It looks cool. It like looks cool on screen, but not real.
No, it is. That's just one of the things that I love I love looking at, and it does a remarkably good job. Now, later on, the battles are more Hollywood-esque, but I still remember seeing that opening scene and just thinking like, yes, it's not over the top. It's just brutal, short, shoving. That's what it is. Because even when you see like these descriptions in battles, and this is another thing of romanticization, people talk about battles in which, thousands of men are killed and all this stuff. And the reality was all those numbers are usually heavily dramatized. When you would see these grand armies, and I'm sure you probably saw this when it came to the studies for Vikings, when they're talking about a big battle, that big, huge, massive battle is probably like a couple hundred people. And that's
It's just because I think one of the problems with Vikings with why they were so heavily romanticized is because, like, if we think back to their primary sources, we don't have that much. Like, we either have like Icelandic sagas that were written after the fact by like people who wanted to romanticize their ancestors and be like, oh my God, so cool. They could fight 10, 20 men in one go. There was this one kid who could drink beer and someone else could fight a dragon. Like, it's more dramatic because like they're like looking back at their past and they're like, wow, that was us. That's amazing. And then the other is like the monks writing about Vikings. And of course they want to make them look like savage beasts because I mean, the Vikings were taking their money, but like also like if you had, I don't know, like it's of course they're going to paint them like a bad bloody picture, and not to say that the Vikings weren't gory or like bloody at all. But I think that because of that, we tend to think of them as way more bloody than they actually were. Like they were just like pretty much, they were violent, but not as violent as we depict them.
Well, yes, in terms of the romanticization, it definitely was a more martial, militaristic tradition. I mean, hell, that even comes when you can just look at the idea of faith and even the image of Valhalla and the way that it's separated in terms of the afterlife. Like the grand idea is of a massive final battle, and we know that the Vikings were more martial. We know that they did all these raids. We know that they did all these things, but you couldn't just raid. So typically you'd have a short raiding season that was then followed by long trade expeditions because you'd want to take the slaves and the other items and anything that you had acquired on the journey to the places that would actually make you serious money from it. Like I still remember there's this one detail that was to me hilarious. You know, one of the biggest money-making adventures of any Viking could be?
What was it?
Narwhals.
Yes. Wait, no. It was the walruses that I think they almost hunted to extinction.
That too. But the big prize was narwhals because it was easier to hide. So, you know, there's a thing of like nowadays in modern commerce, and you from studying econ, like everything has to be labeled. We have to properly know what everything is. You have to understand its source. There's very few things that you can just buy without knowing exactly what went into it. Very few things, unless you're going to like a farmer's market. And even then, you can still get in trouble from stuff. So in the old days, when you were trading, what the merchant told you could be just a complete lie. It depended entirely on your ability to understand and know what it was they were saying and doing. And in a world where they very, very, very likely don't speak your language at all and they're miming the stuff or showing pictures or other things, it's very easy to get taken advantage of. So one of the things that the Vikings did is they hunted narwhals and other creatures like walruses to get their tusks, and in the case of the narwhal, its horn, because they would take that down to Constantinople, where they would sell it as a unicorn horn, which was an incredibly valuable medicine that was going to be purchased by everyone. So the tusk was literally worth its weight in gold.
Okay, the smartest merchant move I have ever heard.
Yeah.
And businessman. Brilliant. Yeah. Propaganda. Truly.
It's just one of those things that you're like, you know what? If I was a peasant in the year 900, I'd believe it. I would believe it. Like, what am I supposed to think in that point? You're talking about a narwhal horn that specifically spiraled, and it looks like the image of what we would associate of a fairy tale unicorn. And it's like, yeah.
Now, Constantinople have never probably seen a narwhal. Like, they don't know.
Nope.
That's so cool. Yeah, I learned something new. I knew they almost hunted the walruses to extinction, but I did not know that it's because they were selling their horns or using them for stuff.
I'm pretty sure the walrus did come from the horn as well, but it also came from the fact that as a source of meat in places would have been very valuable. I'm pretty sure the walrus was. If I look this up, I want to look at it because I know for a fact the narwhal won off the top of my head. And I'm pretty sure the walrus too, but I might also be talking out my ass there when it comes to that part. I'm pretty sure though.
Believe you. It's okay. I think so. I remember the walrus, but I don't know if it was the unicorn.
It's okay. This thing is going up on YouTube. And if I got that wrong, I'm going to have like 50 angry comments that are just going like, no, it was because the blubber was specifically utilized as a kind of early lamp oil to replace whale or something. I don't know. Something along those lines.
For like a very specific thing that you said. They're like, well, actually.
Yeah, well, actually. God, how many times has that happened to you?
Oh, too many. And especially with like the recent video that I just came up with, because I don't know if you know about this, but not a lot of people do. Right. So in Europe, people were obsessed with Vikings during the 1800s, and they were like, oh, the past, that was like epic. So there was a whole movement also in the US that was trying to point that the Vikings came to specifically the US, not because like we know that they had like a little settlement in Canada, but we don't know that until later.
Mm-hmm.
So specifically that the Vikings came to the US, to Boston, called Waterfront. Like there are these statues of Leif Erikson, and there's these like plaques that say like Leif Erikson's house was built here in Finland. And like it's all over Boston. It's the most bizarre thing you can imagine. So this was part of an academic movement that became known as Vinland Fever, where people were trying to prove that the Vikings arrived to the US so that the US could have a sort of link to the Middle Ages, that they could have some sort of white origin story that was fantastical and mythological, and that proves that white people had been in the US way before Christopher Columbus. Because this was another thing where because Leif Erikson was
it's the Northern Germanic versus, say, the Southern Italic peoples, because there was a whole thing about the degrees of immigrants of what they wanted. They wanted less Italians, less Spaniards, less that, but they wanted more Germanic people.
Exactly.
More to some degree. Some places did want more Irish, but for the most fact, it was Germanic.
Yeah.
Oh.
So weird thing where like people wanted to get rid of the Christopher Columbus narrative and replace it with the Leif Erikson one. And here's the thing. There was no real evidence, but people made it up. Like people sat down and they created these fake rune stones.
They made rune stones. They just made runes, just like buried under something. Like, we're going to discover this in 20 years. It's not going to be a problem. We're just going to put it here.
If you look it up, there's like the Kensington runestone, the Choctaw runestone, like they're like in Minnesota, Oklahoma, like these random runestones that have all been proven false by academics. Like they're all like, nope, this was not meant by the Vikings. People still believe it. I don't know why. It's a huge conspiracy. But people have been like, no, these aren't even real. There was even a Vinland map. So if anyone doesn't know, but Vinland was the name of the settlement that was supposedly in the Americas from the Icelandic saga about Vinland. The land of wine. And so there was this Vinland map that I'm pretty sure it was Yale that outline, and they were like, oh, this is from the 1300s or whatever. And Yale put it on display, and everyone was like, oh my God, the Vikings were in America. That's awesome. Thank you so much. False. This was all false. Mooring holes, fake runestones, fake maps, fake skeletons, which I'm not entirely sure how they did that. Yeah.
I remember the map. I do remember the map. I had no idea about the Boston or the runestones in Minnesota and all those places. Because it's like, there's this idea of when actual Germanic and Scandinavian peoples were immigrating to the United States, they did primarily stay up in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, like Montana. Like that is primarily the region, like just moving westward. It moved west and north. Like that's where those peoples went. So I would understand someone going, oh yeah, no, this was a thing that was brought over on the ship by my grandpa or something back in the 1800s. It's like, no, they're just claiming that it was here already.
Exactly. And the weirdest part is that like all these monuments are still up. Like they're fully just like,
are they
in
now?
You can go and see the Leif Erikson statue. And it's just him going like this. And it's actually, there's a weird thing that's called a Leif Erikson Day. So instead of Christopher Columbus Day, people get together and they celebrate Leif Erikson, quote unquote, because nobody discovered anything, as the discoverer of the Americas.
I mean, if we're going to give anyone credit for it, like that is more like and I'm not talking about this from, say, a moralistic standpoint of like whether you hate Columbus or not for anything. It's if we're looking about it in terms of actual discovery, then yeah, that is actually true, that it was, because they have confirmed, literally, was it last year, that the Vinland settlement that people said was real, but it was like always in dispute. It's like, no, it actually was confirmed. It is real. Like they had the final confirmation study that showed it is a real site, real artifacts, real everything. So because before they didn't have like the physical evidence, they just had the stories and like the places that could be, but nothing really definitive.
Yeah. So that one's in Newfoundland, Canada.
Yes.
And yeah, that came about a lot later. And so, but all of this, like all this fake runestones, fake maps, everything was done before they actually found real evidence. Everyone was kind of like, Vinland was in the like they said specifically, they were in the US. Actually, this strangest thing, this also set up a bunch of weird conspiracies. There's this one guy that wrote an entire book. I think it's really, really long. It's called The Pedigree of the Washington Family Tree. And it talks about how George Washington, everybody knows George Washington, somehow is related to Thorskyn, one of the Vikings from Vinland, also Harold Bluetooth, the king of Norway, and eventually Odin.
Okay. For anyone that might be a little bit confused, when you say that statement, I wasn't shocked about that at all. I would firmly believe that someone would do that, because you're talking about one of the most common practices in all of human history of claiming legacy from something that you are very, very likely not related to. Do you have any idea how common that was in the medieval world, in like of people associated with their genealogy and their legacy, like what they were connected to for the historical greatness of people just like, oh yeah, no, I found that my great like grandfather was actually Alexander the Great. We're connected. And my scribe that I paid 300 gold bars to, he managed to find the connection in some dusty old tome down in Alexandria. I don't know how he did it, but he did. So it's like, clearly I'm the rightful ruler of everything. Just saying.
Well, see, the thing is, I would never imagine that someone would just make a book about this in the 80s in the US. Like, I thought it would have been, like, I thought that was like a medieval practice. But now that you mention it, I do have a lot of people in my comment sections on TikTok going, I'm the descendant of this and this Viking. So I disagree with what you're saying. I'm like, I talk to professors and do research, man. Like, I don't know what you want me to do.
And the thing, I've always had to tell my stuff for family, with people, for anyone that tries to claim a specific thing, when you're talking about history, it is very, very difficult to get into specifics. I tell people over and over again that I talk about general world history of things interacting. So when you have people that are making extremely specific claims, unless it's backed up with hard evidence, it's notoriously difficult to actually do anything with it. Yeah. That's kind of what happens. And you have people claiming legacy. I mean, there's the classic joke of like I'm 1/8 Cherokee, and like that whole thing in the United States. And it's like some people quite literally are. It's like, hell, I can't even remember. I think I remember something along the lines that it's like I'm 1/16th, if I recall correctly. Or no, it's not like 1/8. The joke is 1/16th, but I think I actually am. But now even just saying that, I'm going back and questioning, and I have to inquire with my family for the very specific name just in case it is, because I just remember hearing that at one point as a child and thinking like, oh, okay. And then that's it. That's all that it is. But you have these stories that are just passed down generation to generation to generation, that it becomes harder and harder to say anything definitive about.
Yeah, 100%. Actually, now that this might be like, this was another part of the movement in the US, like the Vinland fever, because some of the things that they were doing, because there's like multiple runestones, is that they would take actual carvings made by Native Americans, and they would be like, oh, this is it. This is Vikings.
Yeah. No, I actually have seen a couple of those before of people doing that. Or it's like, I still remember it was Vikings or aliens. And it's like, those are the two. It's like, it's like, well, technically speaking, the Vikings, when they were here, they were the aliens of the land. Yes, that is true. They were. So you could, if you want to use that linguistic, gymnastics, you could say that potentially, but not in the way that people are thinking.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, that absolutely was a thing. There was another part that I was going to ask you about here pertaining to the research. Where were you when you were there?
Okay, so when I was there, I was in Denmark, and then I was in Stockholm, Sweden, and I went to Uppsala for one of the video recordings about kind of like how Viking history becomes more mythological and more fantastical than actual fact. And then I went to Norway, Oslo.
Okay, so you went to all three.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the thing that I wonder is a lot of people think about Vikings as a catch-all term because it kind of was. Because for anyone that is confused or isn't aware, Viking is a verb. Like that's like the act of going a Viking. So when someone was going for a raid, the majority of people, they were not soldiers. They were not fighters. Yes, they had a more martial tradition. Yes, they were preparing more for actual skills to be able to raid, and they would train for this. But it was farmers, fishermen, traders, weavers, just it was people who just go, winter went to like 2 months too long this year, so half our crops are dead. Let's go burn some other people's stuff and take their things. I think that'll help us. So they would do that. Like that was one of the common things. Is like especially before modern agriculture and developments, populations were much smaller, and you would survive. You would get wealthier. You would show your prowess. There was a cultural, there was an economic, there was a subsistence reason to raid, to do these things. So you'd have just fishermen that after the season would go raiding. And it's like, that's what you would do. And like the raiding season couldn't go on for too long because you had to get back before the bad weather would set in, and you needed to be able to tend to your crops. It was like the old adage of the soldiers that when you would be drafted off for war, you were like, the actual fighting season would usually take place from spring going into early summer, kind of. It really would depend. So the other big one is you'd have that short fighting period, and then you have the fighting period in the fall, because people didn't fight in winter, and summer was meant for crops. So you had to be able to tend your crops. So there was like 2 little fighting seasons that people would have before it would settle down. And you had the same kind of concept. That's why one of the big raiding ones is you had to get in there in fall right after harvest so that you could go in and take all the wheat and everything else and then go back home.
Yeah. And it's actually, see, that's one of the things that I found really interesting, because like part of my research was like the Viking legacy today, and seeing how the term Viking is like changing. Because I went to like these things that were like Viking festivals. They were called Viking festivals. And I went to like Viking exhibits in museums, and they're all called Viking, which goes with the term raiding and trading. Mm-hmm. But once you get into either like, for example, once you get into the museum and you see the exhibition, 90% is just talking about Scandinavian settler society. They just use Viking because like that's what's popular.
It'll draw in the tourists. I mean, hell, yes. I was at the Nordic Museum there in Stockholm.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was at that one, and I also went to the Viking Heritage Museum in Stavanger, Norway. So that's where I was. So I saw the bunkers that were built out there, which that was also awesome to look at. And then just everything that is there. You see these cruise ships, right? These cruise ships would pull up directly into the fjord, and they would drop off people. And you see this stream of tourists, and then you look like, oh wait, what are all these shops that are lined up along the coast here, right as the tourist, ships are dropping off, and it's just Viking, just in a line, just going down the port, and you're like, I see, okay,
yeah, they came with a plan.
Oh yeah, they did. One of the things that we went into, which was rather interesting, I hadn't done that before, was it was a Viking VR experience. That was a company worked to recreate in 10 minutes, the story leading up to of the mythos of the Battle of Hafrsfjord, the battle that would create the Kingdom of Norway, that we only have record of in the Icelandic sagas, and an idea that it could have taken place in Stavanger, which is why there's giant sword statues that are there. But it could have been there. It could have been like 50 miles up the coast. It could have been any one of these. We don't know. There's no physical evidence for any of it. There's just the Icelandic sagas. And that's it.
songs, man. Of course, they make everything like dramatic. Did you go to the Burka village?
Do I get to go to what?
The Burka village in Sweden?
No, I did not. No, we were only in Stockholm for the limited amount of time to go to Paradox Con because I work with Paradox Interactive, which makes all of those historical strategy games. And then from there, we flew out to Stavanger almost immediately.
Okay, so, cool.
I would like to be able to go and explore more, but the plan as it is now is we are looking at going and hitting up like Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Austria on our next trip over. Though it really depends on where we're able to fly into and what prices are like, because I mean, I do this as the job of creating it here. So I'm really glad that you have like the it's not a stipend. You have like a specific thing that funds you to enable you to go and do a number of these things for your projects and research, right?
Yeah. So it's essentially like if any students out there, your university will give you money if you apply for like awards and grants and you just do research. And then I, instead of writing a paper, decided to make a mini documentary series.
That's awesome. That is so awesome. Like, I wish that I could have done something like that when I was in college. But the only thing that I did was limited is that I studied for a semester abroad in Japan. And which was awesome. I'm just really glad that I was there because I was in Yamaguchi, which is right next to Hiroshima. So I got to go to all the atomic museums and everything that was there. It was really cool, but I didn't get to do necessarily anything beyond that. And I'd always wanted to study abroad. So that was the first time that I was out of the country, and the only time, well, only until literally 3 weeks ago when I was in Europe. So I want to be able to do a lot more traveling. I want to be able to see more things because I really want to be able to go to some of the castles and the different scenes and the spots where they had all the fights and everything and just film there.
Just,
yes.
To be there. Like, it's just insane. Like, I remember one of my favorite moments was like, so the Red Wedding, I think there's like different Red Weddings, but one of the Red Weddings was in Perugia in Italy. Mm-hmm. And they like the specific castle where it happened. It's like this fortress that's like made underground. And there's like, it's like a shopping center, but just walking in there, it just like, you can like imagine the scene like playing in your head. It just, everything changes and it like comes to life. And I don't know, like knowing the history behind the places you go visit just is so freaking exciting because it makes it so much more than just like a pile of rocks or a building. Like, it's like, wow.
Yes. When we were in Sweden and we went to the Royal Armory Museum, I say that the Royal Armory Museum, it was just the Royal Armory that they've converted part of it into a museum. It was like the guy who we were with, there's a member of my Discord, and he was just showing us all the different things that he knew from that they had up there. And he's here's Charles XII, right? And oh, look, there's the bullet hole from where he got shot. And look, he even still has some of the dried blood. Because it's true. It's like you go into all these things and it's like where they have stuff preserved. It's like they took the clothes, like he has the mud still on his like cloak from where he fell after he got shot in the head. They have Gustavus Adolphus's horse there, fully taxidermied, because when he died, the testaments, I think, in his will specifically said that he wanted to go with his horse. So they taxidermied his horse and sent it with him to the afterlife. So you just walk into this thing, and we're talking about like a European charger. Like this isn't a race horse. This is a war horse. It is a monster of a beast when you see it. And it's shrunken as well because it's partially mummified. So it's not as big as it was, but it's still huge. Like I'm in Kentucky, right? I'm in Kentucky, which is the land of horses. There are horses everywhere. Like we're just horse farms for days all over. The horses here are like these lithe horses that are based off the Arabic like race horses and these ideas. So it's a mix between the big, stout, like heavier set European ones and the more nimble, like fast Arabic ones. So that combination of them creates a really, really like the best race horse in the world. But when you go and see that war horse in firsthand, you're like, damn, that explains why you can't just go, oh, yes, I'm going to hold a pointy stick in your general direction. Like, that thing's going to hit. The stick that you're holding with the point on it is going to snap, and it's just going to crush into you.
Tall
Especially if the thing is decked out in armor with barding.
How tall was the horse?
I think, so I'm 5'11". When I was standing next to it, my ear, I believe, was to its shoulder. So, and that was just its shoulder, like at the joint. It still has the whole neck and the rest of its back and everything that is going up.
I'm adding that to the bucket list. 100%.
Like, it was really cool. Now then again, my estimate might be slightly off because what it was positioned on, you couldn't quite see. It had a slight pedestal. So I was trying to judge from where I was at there, but it's still really impressive to see in the first place.
I love how we got to this topic.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the tangents. This is what happens. We go to random facts. Oh yeah, we're going to talk about narwhal tusks related to Vikings. Oh, we're going to talk about eclipses. Welcome to the show.
So much fun. I'm so glad.
Regarding your research of the documentary that you are doing right now, how far along is that? And what's your next step? What are you doing with it? Or what's the next aspect of research that you're going to be doing?
Well, I think, so I'm done with like all the filming. Like now I'm just finishing the editing and like I'm uploading each series or like each episode on YouTube. If anybody wants to go check it out, it's called The Fight Over the Viking Legacy. And so I'm closing that chapter and I'm actually currently applying to grants to make a different documentary series about, I'm looking either to do the history of Turkey because God, I mean, if I could go to Istanbul, that would be freaking brilliant. I could make so many videos. Or I'm also applying to see if I can do a documentary series about the Mongols.
That's awesome. I think that among everything, one that is not covered as much in more Western media would probably be Turkey. But I say covered recently. It was very extensively studied and looked at going in through the 1800s. Like that was a very, very, very big point of study. Particularly with the French, though, that also came with aspects of the Orientalism and the, it's the French. So, I mean, there was different things when it came to painting and the depictions of the harem and other stuff. But I love covering different aspects of Turkey because my favorite ruler in history that I've loved studying is Ibrahim the Mad. So he's my favorite one among any that I've studied. Are you familiar with his story?
No, give me a quick, I need to know now.
Okay. So for anyone that I've covered him extensively in the podcast here before. Ibrahim the Mad got the nickname the Mad because he was locked up in the harem for decades and went crazy. So are you familiar with how the Ottoman harem actually functioned, like how it worked?
Just main wife, lots of other consorts is pretty much all I know.
Technically didn't even have a legal wife. See, the way that it worked within, like the reason why you had the harem was because the idea was to remove dynastic politics. So you would not have a wife. You would have these legal concubines with a head concubine that was your wife, your favorite, that would be yours. Because if the girls are all slave concubines, they don't have a noble family that is backing them that could then potentially interfere in the politics of the empire. Like trying to marry your daughter into royalty so that you can mess with the king, effectively. Like that kind of idea. So they would have all of these concubines that had been either given as a gift, had been taken in war, or as a form of tax, could even be from a province if, people were not able to pay, these kinds of things. So they would come in and then they would have all these children naturally with the Sultan, where sometimes a girl, if she managed to sleep with the Sultan, would only do so once for her entire life. And if you didn't produce a child after that one time, you might not get another shot. If you did produce a child, you became a favorite. You got your own apartment, you got your own servants, you got everything. So that it was literally the definition of the baby mama digging for gold. That's what it was. I'm saying this because they were obviously slave concubines, so it's not necessarily a good situation for them. But in comparison to what it was like for normal people, it's it's kind of a shitty thing that you didn't have your own bodily autonomy for it. But it's you got incredible amounts of power if you managed to rise up from it. So anyway, to fast forward here, because I've gone way off topic when talking about Ibrahim, because now I'm going into the politics of the harem. When you had your child, there were sometimes dozens of princes of the Ottomans. Only one could rule. And so harem politics were very brutal. When a new sultan came to the throne, it was standard practice to commit fratricide. So all of your brothers would be strangled. Usually, after a couple incidents where they almost accidentally extinguished the entire royal line, a couple were kept in reserve, like one or two.
Okay.
But you couldn't have these little princes running around the empire potentially being able to raise a rebellion. So they got locked up. They got locked up inside a place known as the kafes, the cage, which was a segment of the harem where you would keep your heir. They would be educated. They would be taught everything. They would be raised perfectly fine. It's like a bird in a gilded cage, effectively. And they were kept there just in case the sultan died prematurely and didn't have any children. If he did have children, as soon as he had a couple and felt it was safe, that brother that's been raised for the last 10 years in there, ended. So in the case of Ibrahim, he was in there for decades before his brother died. His brother didn't have any children that were able to take the throne. So Ibrahim comes in, but at first he doesn't want to, because he's been basically tortured and scared by his brother for years. He thinks that when the people have come there telling him that his brother is dead, that it's a trick. It's a trick for him to try to raise a rebellion and to step outside, and that's going to get him killed. So he's screaming, no, no, no. He doesn't want to be let out of the cage. He's going to stay in his cage. He doesn't want to leave. His mother has to beg him to come out using scraps of food to get him to come out, and they have to drag the former sultan's dead body in front of him so that he can see that his brother is dead, go up to it and kick it a couple times to confirm that it is indeed dead, and only then is he willing to come out of the cage. But if that, as you can imagine, being locked up in the cage doesn't do a lot for your mental health. He was kind of a little wonky by then. It became very obvious very quickly. So his mother was like, okay, listen, if you would go back to the harem, please, and produce an heir for the empire because it's really needed, I'll just govern things in the meanwhile. It's fine. It'll be okay. So his mother rules the empire for years while he is just prancing around through the harem, spending ludicrous amounts of money. We're talking about the money where he would give away the entire treasury of the empire as a gift for his 3 favorite concubines because they made him happy one time. And the whole country would just crash. So he would have to sell all of these positions within the government in order to get money. So they give away even more gifts. At one point, he loved fur. I just did a podcast episode dedicated to fur from a book. He covered an entire room with sable furs. So, because his favorite activity was to make love on fur. No. That was his favorite thing. So, no, there was a habit that he had of prancing. He didn't like that he had all the power, that women couldn't resist him because he was a sultan. It was no fun. It was the same thing every time. It's like they just lay there and let him have his way. So he got tired of it, and he essentially ordered his concubines to line up in a row while he pranced around them pretending to be a horse and ravished them while they were ordered to try and fight him to escape. Yeah. He also, on that same note for the concubines, after his favorite basically planted a seed to try and cement her power, she told him that one of them was cheating on him. He couldn't figure out who it was despite getting all the guards to try and figure out. So he had all of his concubines tied up in sacks and then thrown into the water.
Actually, I have heard of him because I knew that fact. I did. That is so, rich people are like royals with so much power, just like do the insanest shit ever. Like, it's honestly, it's iconic. It's weird as hell, but like also iconic is not the right word, but like you get it.
Yeah. Now I say this, a number of the things that I possibly said might have been exaggerated. Like this guy was vilified. He was hated. He bankrupted the country multiple times, essentially. No one liked him. And so some of the things may be exaggerated, just as in the case of, say, the pornocracy of the popes, when some of that has happened. But regardless, we know that he was a very disturbed individual.
Yeah.
That's why he's my favorite, because it's just so weird to look at and entertaining.
That's why I love the Borgias. The Borgias and the Medici.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. But, okay, now, we've gone into the whole talk about the Ottomans now. See how this happens? This is what happens with here. So that's one of my favorite fun little stories or facts. Do you have any particular like fun or like weird things that you found besides the besides the whole Americana Viking aspect that you'd like to share before we end this?
That has to do with Vikings or just like anything in general?
Both. In general, if you want to pick one from the Vikings and then one from just what you found while studying abroad and doing all these different things that you've learned.
Okay, well, Vikings, I don't know. I think that might be like the weirdest one was like the weird academic movement in the US.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. They also had like a bunch of like, they created a bunch of like towers also across the US as a memorial to the supposed Viking past. So you can find them. They're all made by this one guy who had a lot of money, and he made the baking soda. He's the one who created the baking soda, and then he took all that money and he was like, oh, I'm going to create all these monuments to Vikings. So that's him.
Perfect. And why not? That's like the story of why am I not forgetting the name here? Oh, I've done a podcast episode on him too. The eccentric in the United States who had he was the merchant who rose up from nothing. Why am I forgetting his story? He just wrote the book with the grammar. I did a whole podcast episode dedicated to this again. This is something that's bothered me. It's like the information is right there and it just keeps on like going.
I think that would be like my strange Viking fact. I guess my favorite history fact. The only thing I'm thinking about right now is kind of okay. Actually, there is this I cannot remember for the life of me. I'm pretty sure that this might be like a little bit legend or like a little bit fact, but I remember speaking to this one professor about Caterina Sforza. I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
The Sforza clan. Yes, I am familiar with the Sforzas because the Sforzas are the ones that one of them led I'm not even going to use the term rebellion. He betrayed multiple things in the Duchy of Milan, specifically in order to to try to create his own independent state. And the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and the Francis I of France were not happy. Like neither one were happy because they both thought that he was on their side respectively. And he just betrayed them both, basically. Tried to do his own thing and failed.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know if it was one of the descendants, but basically there was this woman during the Renaissance. Her name was Caterina Sforza. And so she kind of was like also leading a rebellion against the popes.
Was it in Milan?
I don't know. I think it's like right outside Milan. I'm forgetting like her. You can go visit like the castle or like the fort that she like was on. So basically, I can't remember if it was one of the Borgia sons, right? And they were like about to like invade or like fight her or whatever, and they like kidnapped one of the sons, and so that she would like relinquish her power and like come with them and like I don't know, like be like, okay, yeah, you're right, whatever, I will subdue myself to the Pope. And so I do not remember if this is a legend or if this is actual fact, but there was a rumor at the time that she essentially saw this and she was like, it's okay. She lifted up her skirts and she said to the Borgias, and she was like, take him, take my son. I can always make more. And she literally just pointed at her nether areas.
All right. Yeah. No, I do want to look that up now and see if that's a confirmed thing here, because that is actually a great story. I love that.
Yeah. Can't exactly remember if it was legend or if it was like actual fact, but I remember vividly learning about it. I just don't remember if it was more of a rumor or if it was like, oh no, this happened.
If not real, it might be one of those stories that comes from people at the time who are exaggerating and telling her story to other people. So that's the story that's circulated around like the surrounding states as like propaganda for her in her favor, or maybe even against her in the case of the church if they're going against her.
Yeah. Because also we have to remember that this was a woman during the Renaissance that would believe, like she had like military education, and like she wasn't a little docile princess.
And I remembered who it was that I was talking about. Timothy Dexter. That's the individual. So when we were talking about rich people doing rich weird things, he rose from. Are you familiar who this is?
No.
Okay. Merchant who rose from nothing, partially married into wealth, but then essentially gambled all of that wealth on one big investment for something and struck it stupidly rich. I mean, we're talking stupidly rich multiple times. He is a guy who, when the continental dollar was worthless during the American Revolution, bought up all of it for hard cash from these soldiers for less than a penny on the dollar. Way less than a penny on the dollar. So then when the government came in and said, okay, we can't honor all these bills for what they're actually worth, we will pay them a penny for the dollar. So if he paid, 1/10 of a penny for these bills, he now got 10 times that investment back. So he got all of that money. He then turned around and invested that money into a merchant company that he created to ship products places. And one of the ones to do was to ship bed warmers down to the tropics, because he was told that they didn't have any, and didn't make the connection that they don't need bed warmers because they're not in New England in the north. It's the goddamn tropics. So we're going to just ship these bedpans, which are literally cast iron pans with like long handles, if you know what I'm talking about, that you would stick hot coals in. And during the winter, you'd stick that under your bed, like in between the mattress and the other stuff, so that it warms your bed, because there's no heating or anything else. So you're going to be freezing. So they would do this in New England in like the winter, right? So he ships them down there. Naturally, no one wants them. And then the captain of the ship goes, no, these aren't bed warmers. They're molasses ladles. Yes. And he makes a killing selling them all as molasses ladles. So they do that because you need these really big molasses ladles in order to be able to scoop all this stuff. And there's not really a high quality supply of manufacturing or iron down there. So they're like, yes, we'll take all of them. Completely sells out. So he's like, oh, it must be cold there. They bought all these bed warmers. So he sends down an entire shipment on the next run of winter clothing. We're talking all the fur, mittens, jackets, everything you can possibly imagine. Now, no one's going to want that while down there. But as they were traveling down, they just so happened to have met a ship that was on its way down south under South America, because they were heading to Siberia. So when they were thinking, man, we're going to have no way to buy this clothing and other stuff that we need for this journey, suddenly a ship shows up out of nowhere in like Jamaica that is covered in winter clothing. You're like, yes, we'll buy your whole supply. And they do it to then sell in Siberia, because that's where they're going.
Oh my God.
So he does that. He does that multiple more times with other things. We're talking selling coal to a town that produces coal. We're like, it's just ridiculous. But the reason why I bring him up from anything, because I know we're going off on a whole tangent about him again, and this will be my final thing, is because one of his final actions, I say final actions, one of his big things, he buys a mansion and then just decks it out in the most ludicrous shit you can imagine. Statues. And for him, he wants statues that show how much of an American figure he is. And he gets all of these huge wooden statues that are painted of like the American founding fathers and other figures that he also deems to be historical and very important. Like he had a whole bunch of Native American chiefs that were up there. He had Napoleon. He had himself. He had a whole lot of different things. And that's just one of the stuff that was up there. He had one of these things on here that was Thomas Jefferson. And there's a story of the painter who's working on creating the plaque for it that is that essentially says something along the lines that it's like, so Thomas Jefferson, so he wrote the Declaration of Independence. The painter was putting that on there when Dexter got mad, saying, no, he didn't write the Declaration of Independence. He wrote the Constitution. No, he didn't. So the painter's insisting that's not what it is. Like, he has to put it in here for the plaque. So Dexter goes inside, pulls out his gun, comes back out, and shoots at him. So the painter then writes on it, Thomas Jefferson, creator of the Constitution. And that's just was on the plaque for years because he was threatened with a gun otherwise. And that's his statue story. Yeah. So that's, I've delved even here with more fun facts or varying things. I feel like I'm just pulling from memory all the different stuff that we've covered in podcast episodes in the past. But this is fun. It's what I like doing. I love telling these stories.
And I love learning. Like, it's so much, like, history is so much fun. There's so many random things. Like, I just thought about this, like, random guy that I had no idea existed. He was basically, I don't know. I think he was like Norwegian. And he wanted to prove that ancient Peruvian civilization could reach Easter Islands. So this kid, he's not a kid, he's a man. I just call everyone a kid. So this kid, he decides to make a bamboo raft with the same tools that they would have had in ancient Peru civilization. And so it's just the bamboo raft. And he sets out on the bamboo raft and he sails all the way from the continent of like South America all the way to Easter Island. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but like, hey, and he has
vaguely, I think, but I don't know if I have or not. Like, that's still amazing.
I know, because he has his entire voyage. Like, it's one of the first documentaries that he just makes himself. Like, he's like fully like a vlogger, teaching everyone day by day what he does. And he's like, oh, we don't have food today. We ran out of fish. And so he made like a net underneath the raft. And so he would just jump into the net with his little scuba diving glasses. And he would like try to kill some fish and then get on top and like make a little fire and eat the fish on top of a fire on a floating raft in the middle of the Pacific. It is the most insane thing. So if you end up finding it on YouTube, I really recommend it.
The luck of not having a storm just take him right there is, wow.
Well, he tried to do that again with like a different raft, and I cannot remember. I think it was like, I don't remember, but he tried to do it again. Like, he was successful by, I have no idea how. So he tried to replicate that, but with like a different civilization, and like it went down. Like, it went down. The raft went down, but he survived somehow.
Wow. Dang.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think that is a pretty good one to end things on here. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Do you want to go ahead and give everyone like a kind of farewell and plug your stuff in here again before we go ahead and leave?
Perfect. Yeah, sure. So yeah, my name was Valeria Cuervo. Thank you so much for having me. This was so awesome. I was trying not to fangirl the entire time because I literally followed you on TikTok from the very beginning of COVID. Like, I was like, oh my God. But yes, thank you so much for having me. If anybody wants to check out the Viking stuff that we ended up talking about, I have the full mini documentary series on YouTube. It's called The Fight Over the Viking Legacy. And if anyone wants to follow me on TikTok, I'm Traveling Cuervo. That's the same name. You'll find me podcast, YouTube, everything.
I will make sure to put all the links in the description of this on both podcast as well as the YouTube channel.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. And for anyone who has listened and or watched or anything else, I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember that if you are listening to this on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, you will be able to see the actual visual version of it up on YouTube on the History of Everything pod page. Until then, hope you all have a good rest of your day, and goodbye, guys. Thank you very much.